Hi, my name's Craig West. I'm the CEO and founder of Succession Plus. We are the largest business succession and exit planning advisory firm in Australia. We've been working with business owners in the mid-market to help them maximise business value and achieve a successful exit for over 15 years. During that time, we've learned a lot, we've seen a lot, and hopefully we can share with you some of our experience, some of our knowledge, and the intellectual property we use to help business owners work through what is probably the most important focus area for an owner to work on. How do I maximize the value of my business and achieve a successful exit? Hopefully this webinar helps you understand some of those key issues you should be thinking about as an owner and helping you maximize the value of your business and achieve a successful exit. In this session, I want to talk about succession planning specifically for professional services firms. Those firms cover a lot of different industries and they're typically largely people-driven. And that's one of the reasons succession is really important. This could be architects, engineers, accountants, lawyers, financial advisors, mortgage brokers, real estate agents. A lot of those people businesses rely on a succession strategy to work. As the owners get older and look to exit, they need new, young people to come through that are energized, motivated, and incentivized to help drive the performance of the business. Today, I'm going to talk you through a model that we use called I.C.E.U, Income, Control, Equity, and Unplanned Events. That framework explains how we approach succession planning for professional services firms. But let's start with the why. Why is succession planning so important in these firms? Firstly, they're all about people. The firms don't work without people. They're not an IT startup. They're not a product-based business. They're typically services, professional services, and therefore they require professional staff, experienced staff to work in those businesses and deliver client outcomes. That's how they make money. That's how the business runs. That's how they build equity value. But therefore, it's important to make sure that succession planning is well designed within that firm. Now, some of the challenges we see are typically these decisions are often emotional. Often these firms are started by somebody 25 years ago. They've worked in that firm for a long time. It's their life. It's their baby, if you like. And getting them out of it is often difficult. It also can create over time, because these people go into business because they're typically good at something, good at architecture, good at engineering, good at, whatever it might be, practicing the law, for example, they're not necessarily good at succession or running the business. And so we get typically financial inefficiencies within the firm. We get a blend of income and equity and control. We get a lack of planning around unplanned events. And therefore we get very reactive transitions. They're not well managed. They're not planned in advance, and therefore often they don't work very well. So the key thing here is to have a structured plan around legacy, around value creation or value acceleration, to use our terminology, and continuity and transition planning. Ultimately, that will always deliver a far better result. So let's look at the I.C.E.U model. Let's go through it step by step and talk about the key elements, what's important in each, and how they actually interact and play together to come up with the ultimate business succession and exit planning strategy. So the overview is simple. I stands for income. C is about control and management, so management succession. E is about equity and ownership, and therefore ownership succession. And lastly, the thing no one likes to think about, U, is for unplanned events. What happens if something goes wrong? Let's start with income, because that's pretty important to get right. The key thing here is both the income whilst you're in the business, the remuneration model. What does the salary look like? What are the bonus schemes, both short-term and long-term, look like? What does the income model look like as an owner within that business? But secondly, what does the income model look like post-exit? How do you actually secure the retirement funding? How do you secure that exit income that's so important for partners to have the security to actually leave? The key things that we see going wrong are where people try and tie income to the amount of equity that's owned. They're completely separate and they must be treated separately. There's often a lack of benchmarking. Often salaries are a legacy issue that have been inherited. Often they're increased by a CPI amount every year. Sometimes they're not. And therefore what happens is there's often inequality. There's often a mismatch between professional skills, experience, the revenue or team that's actually managed by an individual, and how much they're actually paid. What that creates is resentment. That's a real issue, because if you've got partners in a business or owners in a firm where the income's not managed properly, where it's not benchmarked, where it's not tracked back to market, it can and will create problems overall. How do we fix that? A couple of key things. Firstly, we have to have a market-based remuneration model. We can benchmark salaries. We know what people should earn. We know what the market's paying. It's really a hygiene factor, but you have to have a market-based salary structure. If your people are earning less than they can get otherwise in the market, it's going to create problems. It should be based on KPI-linked bonuses, not just bonuses that are paid every year or paid no matter what. There has to be performance metrics. What performance requires the earning of what bonus? And then lastly, whilst it's not exactly income, it is really important to establish a promotion pathway, a career progression, a development plan. That's quite important. So we have to look at income across all of those areas. Now we get to C, control. Control is something that most people leave. Most people ignore. Often these businesses have been set up in a traditional partnership model, professional services practice. Think about lawyers and accounting firms, which is my background. They're often based on a partnership model. It's a long-term structure. It's been around for many, many years, hundreds in most cases, but they don't work well. They fail to address the key issue of management succession, and that's ultimately what control's about. What we often see is these businesses are founder dependent. The owner or founder, or maybe one or two partners, or even family members, if it's a family-owned business, the business cannot run without them. Therefore, decision-making is difficult. When there's a difficult decision or a crisis, chaos results. There's unclear governance structures. It's all about the ownership. It's not about separating control, and it should be treated separately, the same as we're separating income and equity. So how do we solve for that? For smaller businesses, an advisory board, bringing in external parties, setting up a governance structure. Governance, of course, accountability, discipline. It's all about setting that in place, structure and mechanism to manage and make decisions around control. If we're larger businesses, then we need to start to think about a couple of key things. Should we have an independent board with non-executive directors? In other words, people who aren't employed by the business, but sit on a board. Industry experts, or perhaps they're an expert in a particular topic, finance or marketing, something that the existing partners don't bring to the table. And lastly, some sort of decision rights process, some sort of guide as to who's got the authority to make what decision. And what that gives you is speed. It means you don't have to wait and check on the partner or on the founder, or wait for somebody more senior to make a decision. It allows you to make decisions quickly and efficiently and move the business forward. That then brings us to equity. Equity equals ownership, and that's obviously pretty important in a professional services firm. The old-fashioned traditional partnership model was all about progressing to an ownership position over a period of time. So the focus here has to be on the ownership structure. What structure we're using? Is it a traditional partnership model? Has it been corporatized, which is quite common now? And more importantly, how do we value and realize the value that sits within that equity? Having an equity structure is not enough if you can't extract the value that sits within that equity. Some of the issues we see here are things like tax inefficiencies, where the ownership structure is no longer appropriate for the business model that we're in. Or perhaps the ownership structure was set up 25 years ago and it was fine then, but it's no longer appropriate. So we need to evolve. We also need to see how we realize the equity that sits within that business. So that covers a couple of key things. Firstly, how do people get out? Is there a buyer? How is that funded? At what value? All those questions need to be answered. Secondly, an exit for one person is an entry for someone else. So how do we manage that? And lastly, we need to think about what happens if there's a dispute. What documents have we got? Have we got a shareholders agreement? Do we have buy-sell agreements? Is that all covered off under our equity model to make sure that we have a clear pathway for younger people coming in, for existing owners to get out, and for the equity and ownership of the firm over time to transition smoothly and effectively without disrupting the entire business. The other thing to think about with equity then is employee share ownership. Should we have our employees as a broader base owning a percentage of equity in the firm? That's what I do in my business, and we've got a lot of clients that do that. It's not necessarily right for everybody, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a separate session. But certainly getting the equity model right is a pretty important part of the succession planning for a professional services firm. The last part, U, stands for unplanned events. What do we do if the proverbial bus hits one of our partners? What happens if somebody gets ill? What happens if there's a sudden exit, or there's a divorce, or there's an illness? All those things are really quite important to think about. No one likes to think about them, but it's really quite important because they have a very, very serious impact on the valuation and the performance of your business. So we want to think about business continuity. This covers a couple of key things. Firstly, what if? If something happens to one of our owners or partners, what's in place? Is there a document that outlines what's going to happen? Is there a funding mechanism, which might be an insurance policy or some other, to cover off how we're going to fund that exit? Is there a process to cover off business continuity? Because it might not be an unplanned event on an owner or a partner. It might be COVID. It might be a natural disaster, a flood or a fire, or the office, or something happens. How do you manage all of that? And so we've got to make sure we've got that contingency planning in place. We've got to make sure we've got succession protocols. What happens if is the question you need to ask yourself. What I see in professional services firms typically is this is not covered well at all. And so if and when something does happen, unfortunately, the effect is far greater. The impact is far worse than it should have or could have been with a bit of simple planning in place. So putting that all together then and thinking about what that looks like is really to think about what's our income model, what's our control or management model, what's our ownership or equity model, and what happens with unplanned events. How do we manage that going forward? What we have to start to think about is how do we manage all of that as part of an overall business succession and exit plan? One of the key issues for professional services firms, because we're dealing with people, is if we don't get the succession model right, people will ultimately leave. Or people will no longer aspire to become a partner or an owner in our firm and look at alternatives. That's not a good outcome for anybody. So we really need to make sure we've got that in place. Now, there's a step-by-step process to implementing I.C.E.U. within your professional services firm. It's made up of a timeline, there's milestones, there's critical success factors, and a whole stack of tools and solutions that need to be put in place to make sure you can successfully implement a business succession and exit plan for your professional services firm. Thanks for joining me for that session. I hope you found it really interesting and informative and hopefully helpful for you in your business. If you want to find out more, there's a stack of resources available on our website. That includes white papers, ebooks, and other webinars like the one you've just seen. Also, feel free to reach out. I've got a team of advisors who are experts in the various areas of business succession and exit planning. They're here to help you. Feel free to reach out, touch base with one of my team. I'm looking forward to being able to help you maximize the value of your business and achieve a successful exit.